and how it played out with different actors across the various remakes. But first, let's talk about the sequel. When they announced Drishyam 2 with the same team, including Mohanlal and Meena, I wondered where it would take the story of George Kutti, because Drishyam is a complete film, as complete as a film can be. The father saves his wife and children, the cops are still in the dark, the major evidence, the victim's body, is someplace it will never be found, even though it's literally under the noses of the police. But then they said the same thing about The Godfather, which was another complete film, as complete as a film can be. When Francis Ford Coppola announced a continuation saga, people wondered where it would go and found themselves stunned with one of the greatest sequels of all time. Let's hope that's the case here. They've said that Drishyam 2 picks up the narrative in close to real time, that is 7 years later. The first film was released in 2013. And they've also said that it's not so much a thriller as a family drama. Will we see the rotting of George Kutti's soul the way we saw Michael Corleone's soul rot? After all, both of them were pulled inadvertently into a crime and then realized there was no turning back. But enough speculation about the sequel. Let's talk about the best scene, which is the emotional confrontation between George Kutti and the parents of the dead boy, IG Geeta, played by Asha Sarath, and her husband. Let's flash back a bit to the point where George Kutti and his family are hauled off to the station. The first thing Geeta asks him is, "Evide ente magan?"
Evide ente magan?
She isn't asking, "Where's the missing person?" This is not just another case. This is personal. The missing person is her son. She's asking, "Where's my son?" This is the point where the subtext of Drishyam becomes the text. This isn't the usual good versus evil thriller about crime, that is George Kutti, and punishment, that is Geeta. It's about two parents now, one father, one mother, who will go to any length to save their children. After this Evide ente magan stretch, we get the famous digging scene. You all know what happens. George Kutti wins, and we get this conversation between George Kutti and his wife Rani, played by Meena. She's read about Geeta's resignation in the paper. She's upset. Rani tells George Kutti, "Geeta may be a powerful IG, but she's also a mother. We are responsible for their miseries."
എത്ര വലിയ IG ആണെന്ന് പറഞ്ഞാലും അതിനെല്ലാം അപ്പുറം അവരൊരു അമ്മയല്ലേ? സത്യത്തിൽ നമ്മളല്ലേ അവരെ ദ്രോഹിച്ചത്?
George Kutti very matter-of-factly replies, "It's your good heart that makes you think this way. Look at it from another perspective. If our daughter had become the victim of such a disaster, wouldn't Geeta have tried to save her son? Man is selfish by nature. Everything we hold dear is important to us. If we think otherwise, we will not be able to survive."
മനുഷ്യ സഹജമായ സ്വാർത്ഥതയാണിത്. നമുക്ക് പ്രിയപ്പെട്ടതെല്ലാം നമുക്ക് വലുതാണ്. മറിച്ച് ചിന്തിച്ചാൽ ജീവിക്കാൻ സാധിക്കില്ല.
And so we get to the film's best scene, where George Kutti is summoned by Geeta and her husband. They admit that they spoiled their son and thus were indirectly responsible for his death. Geeta's husband says, "We have harmed your family and we apologize."
അറിഞ്ഞും അറിയാതെയൊക്കെ നിങ്ങളുടെ കുടുംബത്തെ ഞങ്ങൾ ഒരുപാട് ദ്രോഹിച്ചിട്ടുണ്ട്.
But they still want to know what happened to the son. Is he missing? Is he dead? They say, every time the phone bell rings or the doorbell rings, it's his voice that echoes in our ears. Should we wait for him? George Kutti flashes a look at Geeta. It's almost like he's thinking, should I tell them? But he bows his head. They think he's not going to say anything and they begin to leave. And then George Kutti starts talking. "You have a large heart," he says, "but I am an ordinary man. My wife and my children, that's my whole world." We see now that George Kutti is being vague, but slowly he gets a little more specific. "An unwanted guest invaded our privacy," he says. "In a moment of panic, we made a mistake. We ensured he'd never come back to ruin our lives. We sent the guest back." This far, Mohanlal has not been looking at Geeta and her husband. He's been looking at the ground, and now he raises his eyes and looks at them. He says, "Without intending to, we shattered your dreams. We wish to beg your forgiveness. We did this 1,000 times in our hearts. Please forgive us." His palms are clasped in the sign of a prayer, but his voice is very steady. Geeta and her husband leave. The camera zooms in and we get the hint of tears in Mohanlal's eyes. Now let's look at Papanasam and how Kamal Hassan plays this scene. The character is named Suyambulingam. Many people said that Kamal played the scene too sentimentally, but then this sentimentality comes from the writing itself. As in Drishyam, we first get the man and wife scene. Like George Kutti, Suyambulingam says man is selfish by nature, but in this Tamil universe, we get a softer man, a more, yes, sentimental man. Unlike George Kutti, Suyambulingam adds a note of crushing regret. I raised my daughters to tell the truth. Now I taught them how to lie. That's the guilt that's killing me.
நெசந்தான் பேசணும்னு கண்டிப்பா வளர்த்த பிள்ளைகளுக்கு பொய் சொல்ல சொல்லி கொடுத்துட்டேன். அந்த குத்தோட தான் என்ன கொன்னு எடுக்கு.
And we see this guilt when he's summoned by Geeta, again played by Asha Sarath, and her husband. He keeps looking at them and then looking at the ground as though unable to meet their eyes, even though he wants to. It's practically the same setup. The camera is behind a protagonist, hiding his reactions from us as Geeta's husband delivers his long monologue, and then as they both begin to leave, Suyambulingam begins to speak. But unlike George Kutti, Suyambulingam is an emotional mess. That extra line he told his wife about the guilt that's killing him, that is reflected in the victim's father's confession, that he feels the guilt too about the way he raised his son. He even uses the same phrase that Suyambulingam did to describe this feeling of guilt, kutra unarchi.
அவனை சரியா வளர்க்க எங்களால முடியல. அந்த குற்ற உணர்ச்சி எங்களை கொண்டுட்டு இருக்கு.
And to me, Kamal's sentimental performance is a direct reflection of these extra layers of sentimentality in the writing of this movie. Papanasam is deliberately and confidently old style. Even earlier, there's a reference to the film Padikada Medai, which starred Shivaji Ganeshan, the emperor of the sentimental performance.
எனக்கு தான் படிக்காத மேசன்னு இருக்கலாம்ல.
அண்ணாச்சி அது மேதா அண்ணாச்சி.
தெரியாமையால சொல்லுதோ? நான் படிக்கல. ஆபீஸ்ல மேசை இருக்கா? முதலாளி படிக்காத மேசை. வழங்குதா?
We slowly see that the film's title, which means uneducated genius, is an allusion to Suyambulingam himself. This man is also someone who has hardly been to school, and yet he has the street smarts to do what he does in the movie. He even says his hairstyle is like Shivaji's, and I'd add, so is the performance. It's pitched at a higher level than Mohanlal's performance.
நான் இதை சுருட்டி விட ஆரம்பிச்சு 30 வருஷம் ஆயிட்டு. இது சிவாஜி ஸ்டைல்.
The tears we saw in Mohanlal only during the zoom in at the very end, they are already brimming over in Kamal's eyes, even as he begins to talk to Geeta and her husband. And note the final sentimental touch. After Suyambulingam says everything that George Kutti said, he now points to the river ahead, the river that is called Papanasam, which is believed to cleanse one's sins away. He says he will slowly cleanse his sins away too.
எவனோ வெளியூர்காரெல்லாம் மாறும். இதுல குளிக்க பாவத்தை கழுவிட்டு போறேன். நான் உள்ளூர்காரன். கொஞ்சம் கொஞ்சமா முங்கி எங்க பாவத்தை கழிச்சுக்கிட்டு.
This touch, this hint of atonement makes this scene heavier than the one in Drishyam. George Kutti was in an existentialist zone. His only thoughts about what he did are what he told his wife. Man is selfish by nature. Suyambulingam, on the other hand, is in a religious and moral zone, with the protagonist openly admitting that he has sinned. Is one approach better than the other? Some of us may pick one flavor over the other, some of us may pick one actor over the other, but both performances come from the way the protagonist is written in each case. If Kamal has amped up the emotional theatrical factor, it's because the film is itself more emotional and theatrical. The Hindu quoted Jeetu Joseph as saying as much. Apart from changing some sensibilities to suit local audiences, we made Papanasam more emotional, as Kamal sir felt Tamil audiences like to be emotionally piqued. Whether that's indeed true, we leave for a different day. Now let's look at the Hindi version. AjayDevgn chooses the stoic Mohanlal route with just the tiniest touch of Kamal's sentimentality. But mostly, he's essentially shrugging and saying, look, my family is important to me and I will do anything for them. So I regret the fact that this happened, but sorry, I guess. There's very little overt remorse. He's like Arjuna on the battlefield, single-minded in his belief that dharma has been upheld. Now look at the Kannada version. Ravichandran takes the stoicism to Zen levels. Unlike in the other versions, he even admits they killed the boy.
ಬೇರೆ ವಿಧಿ ಇಲ್ಲದೆ ಅವನು ಮತ್ತೆ ತಿರುಗಿ ಬರ್ದಿರೋ ಜಾಗಕ್ಕೆ ಕಳ್ಸಿಕೊಟ್ಟಿದ್ದೀವಿ.
And he adds, my heart says I did the right thing.
ದಯವಿಟ್ಟು ನನಗೆ ಕ್ಷಮಿಸ್ಬಿಡಿ. ನಾನು ಮಾಡಿದ ಸರಿ ಅಂತ ನನ್ನ ಮನಸ್ಸು ಹೇಳ್ತಾ ಇದೆ.
The most interesting variation is in the Telugu version where Venkatesh plays the father. He tells the victim's parents that he didn't realize his actions would affect another family the way his own family had been affected. This creates a beautiful equivalence between both sets of parents. Remember how George Kutty began his monologue? You have a large heart. The Telugu version takes this line further. At the end of his speech, Venkatesh says, "With that large heart, please forgive me."
పెద్ద మనసు చేసుకొని ఇంత దూరం వచ్చారు. అదే పెద్ద మనసుతో మమ్మల్ని క్షమించి వెళ్ళండి సార్.
He doesn't drown in guilt like Swayambulingam, but his bloodshot eyes and the tears in them tell us he's feeling something inside. So which version of George Kutty works best? Malayalam, Tamil, Hindi, Kannada or Telugu? In a way, I'd say all of them because they show how the same scene can be shaped differently through a combination of the writing and the performers and the perceived tastes of the target audiences. But yes, if you held a gun to my head, I'll go with Mohanlal.